Well, God is the God that changes us. We cannot change ourselves. We continue with our study of Shabbat. This is the second part. We read before in Exodus how God told us to remember the Shabbat day, because on that day, and it is actually the only commandment where God gives a reason why we should do it, so we should pay attention to this reason, okay? He says, remember the Shabbat because God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh day. And He sanctified it. God has finished everything. Man came into a prepared place where everything was done, where everything was given to him by grace, in a sense. He didn't have and could not earn anything. But the Ten Commandments also repeat in Deuteronomy. And in Deuteronomy, it appears a little differently. In Deuteronomy, here it says, remember the Shabbat day. In Deuteronomy, it says, keep the Shabbat day. But not just that, the reason that is given is also different. In Exodus, the reason that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. In Deuteronomy, it says, because God has brought us out of the land of Egypt from slavery into freedom. God has redeemed us out of slavery with an outstretched arm. Now, those reasons are combined. Those reasons are there. Now, the Jews said, well, how come there is a difference? And they said, well, God said at the same time, keep and remember. I don't know. I don't think so. Okay, God doesn't say two words at the same time. Otherwise, it would have been written in both places. But it is important that we keep in order to remember. Remembering is an important part of the Shabbat. That's why we have to keep it. Because we tend to forget. I don't know about you, but I tend to forget things that God has done. I tend to forget what God has done in my life. Every time I come into trouble, every time I have difficulties, I forget how He redeemed me in the past, how He saved me, how He provided. And again and again and again, God has to remind me that, because I am a forgetful person. I'm a sinful person. And out of that, I keep forgetting. Well, that's why we have to keep the Shabbat in order to keep remember the things that God has done. And the things that we are told to remember is the fact that He created everything, that we came into a prepared place without earning it, and that He is the one that redeemed us. We cannot redeem ourselves. We couldn't redeem ourselves. He is the one that brought us out of slavery to sin into freedom in the Messiah. He is the one that brought Israel out of slavery from Egypt into the promised land. Israel could not release themselves. Many times we think, well, if I do this and I do that, and I can. No, we cannot. We have to come to a place where the Shabbat is there to remind us that there's nothing we can do to earn our salvation, but not just earn our salvation when we're saved. There's nothing we can do today to bring us out of the mess that we are in. There's nothing we can do to earn anything from what God has done. So let's look at what we need to remember, because we need to keep the Shabbat in order to remember. So first of all, we need to remember what was. We need to remember that it was God that created the world. We need to remember that He did everything and He rested. There's no work. There's nothing. See, God, we have to understand that God does not need us. Many of us, many Christians, we say, oh, God saved us because there is something special that He wants me to do. He came and He saw something special in me. The Bible tells us that no, there was no good in us. It is the grace of God that saved us, not us. Not that God said, oh, I cannot finish saving the world unless I choose Israel to do this kind of work. God doesn't need me. He wants to use me. He does me a favor when He uses me. But He doesn't need me. And that's something the Shabbat is there to remind us. See, when we stop to rest, we think the world cannot be without us. We think the world cannot cannot exist unless we keep doing the things and running and doing and this and that and the other. Well, when we stop everything and rest, you know what? We get up in the morning and guess what? The sun is still shining. The moon is still rising. The birds are still chirping, as I hope you can hear in the background. The world continues. It's there to remind us that God really doesn't need us. He finished everything. We didn't have to earn what God has done. We cannot earn what God has done. He completed everything. It is good to remember that we were slaves. It is good to remember that we cannot and couldn't save ourselves, but He is the one that did it. He has brought us from slavery. It's good to remember where we come from, because as the further away we go from that place, the longer we're saved, the more we forget what God has done. We have to remember that God has saved us with a strong arm, with outstretched hand. And you know, the outstretched arm is what Jesus has done. He outstretched His arms to save us. We don't need to do anything. We have to remember that. That's what the Shabbat is there to remind us. And we have to remember that we have not been redeemed. We have not been saved because of us. There was nothing good in us. We were saved because God chose to love us. He didn't have to love us. He chose that. He is a good God. He chose to love us. He didn't have to do it. We have to remember also for the present, because as we live our life, we keep forgetting the place of God in our lives. We have to remember that God is in control. God is in control of everything. We look at history, we look at what happens in the world and the economy and the wars and the rumors of wars and the earthquakes and the floods, and we say, hey, what's happening here? God is in control. You know, in Acts, it tells us that He set the borders and the times of the people. I think it's chapter 17. God set the history of the nations. God set the borders. We don't need to worry about the borders of Israel and fight for it, because God set it. We don't need to worry about the borders of Holland, of America, of anywhere. We don't need to go and fight people, because God set the borders. God set the times. He is the one that takes care of it. And it doesn't depend on our work and our excitement and our fighting for it and our rioting and our whatever. God is in control. We can actually be with Him. See, the reason God created us on Shabbat is to remind us that He created us to be human beings, not human doings. You know, God did not create us to do, He created us to be with Him. The most precious time I have with my wife is a time when we spend time together. We may not do things together, but we may sit in the lounge and she reads and I do something, but it's precious and intimate time, and that's what God created us for relationship with Him, for intimacy with Him. That's what the Shabbat comes to remind us. That's why we have to remember for today. We have to remember that we don't need to try hard, to work hard, even to study the Bible and to pray in order for God to love us more. He loved us until the end. He loves us the same as He loved Jesus. That's what the book of John tells us. He loved us to the end, until He was willing and did die for us. We have to remember that He is the guy that provides for us, the God that provides for us. See, in Shabbat, in the desert, God provided for His people the manna, and on Shabbat it lasted for all the time. God is the God that provides all the time. We don't need to worry about the provision. We don't need to work hard. We don't need to be anxious. We can just rest in Him, because He has done everything and He provides. We have to remember that He is the one that changes. We cannot change ourselves. You know the story of Baron Munchausen, where he's drowning in the pool and he tries to pull himself out? Well, he grabs himself in the hair and he pulls himself out of the water. Well, that's how many of us view our spiritual lives. We have to work hard to pull ourselves out of our drowning. Well, God is the God that changes us. We cannot change ourselves. And as we're resting in Him, and we rest in the fact that He finished everything, and we spend the time in the intimacy and the relationship with Him rather than trying to please Him or trying to do things for Him, then He changes us. He is the one that makes us holy. It says He sanctified the Shabbat. We didn't sanctify this. We cannot sanctify ourselves. He is the one that sanctifies us. That's what the Shabbat is there to remind us. Also in the future, we have to remember what is coming, what is the future bringing. And it brings the millennium. It brings the place where there will be no tears. It brings the place where there will be no pain, no suffering. And we have to remember that. It helps us to go through our difficult time today when we remember what is actually coming. That's what the Shabbat is there to remind us.